All right, so welcome everyone to the final day of the conference. So this is our fourth session on advanced encryption. And our first talk will be on sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption from sub-exponential DDH by Abhishek Jain and Zhengzhong Jin. And Zhengzhong will be giving the talk.
Thanks for the introduction. So homomorphic encryption is an encryption scheme with the following feature. So given any ciphertext of some message X, you can homomorphically evaluate some function f over the ciphertext and obtain the ciphertext of some message f of x. It has many applications in cryptography, such as computing over encrypted data. And previously, we know how to build fully homomorphic encryption from either lattice assumptions or indistinguishability obfuscation. However, based only on group-based assumptions, we only know how to achieve degree 2 homomorphism, such as the computing of 2 DNFs. So we ask, can we build homomorphic encryption from group-based assumptions for a larger class of functionality? And in this work, we consider the following variant of sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption. So this is an encryption scheme that supports homomorphism for some function f, for some class of function f. Moreover, the decryption algorithm can either output the correct message f of x or some button symbol. Crucially, we relax the decryption correctness probability. So we define the following sometimes decryptable property, which only requires that the probability that the decryption is correct is lower bound by some negligible function, but we require this function must not be too small. For example, we only require the decryption correctness to be lower bound by some 2 to the minus lambda to the c, where lambda is the security parameter and c is some constant between 0 and 1. So I will formally introduce this notion of sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption later. So now you may wonder why this is useful. Since the decryption error is too small, why this is useful? And indeed, such a kind of notion is already very useful in cryptographic proof systems, where in the actual construction of the prover and the verifier, we only need to use the encryption algorithm and the homomorphic evaluation algorithm. And the decryption algorithm is only used in the security proof. So by further using complexity leveraging and set the security parameter correctly, we can still prove the security of cryptographic proof systems. Indeed, previously, such an idea is already used to construct cryptographic proofs. For example, in the construction of statistical zap arguments, the construction uses sometimes decryptable, sometimes extractable commitment, where the extraction correctness of the commitment scheme is only used to prove the soundness of the statistical zap arguments. And a similar construction is also in the recent works of Snarks and Nizix, where the correctness of somewhere extractable commitment or the correctness of FHE is only used to prove the security of Nizix or Snarks. So for this notion of sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption, can we build them to support a large class of functionality from group-based assumptions? And here is our result. We show how to construct this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption for TC0 from sub-exponential DDH assumption. Recall that TC0 is the complexity class of constant depth threshold circuits. As applications, we show how to use this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption to construct succinct non-interactive arguments. Recall that Snarks is the following protocol between a prover and a verifier in the common reference string model, where the prover tries to convince the verifier that some instance X is in some NP language L by sending a single round of message, where the prover is given the instance X and the NP witness W, and the succinctness requires that the proof size to be much smaller than the NP witness length. In the end, the verifier can decide to accept or reject this proof. And we require the following two properties about these snarks. The first property is completeness. It says that for any instance X that is in this language L, the honestly generated proof should always be accepted. And the soundness says that for any instance X that is not in the language, then for any efficiently computable proof, it should always be rejected. So this snarks also has many applications in cryptography, such as the delegation of computation. It also has been implemented in blockchain and cryptocurrencies, such as secure rollups. So as our first application, we show how to build snarks for any NP language that has a polynomial size TC0 frag logical proof of non-membership. So this is a subclass of NP languages where for any instance that is not in this language, we require the existence of a frag logical proof to prove that this instance is really not in the language. Moreover, we require each line of the proof to be a TC0 formula and the size of the proof to be a polynomial. So this already puts this complexity class in a subclass of NP cap co-NP, because you can build a frag logic proof as a co-NP witness. So why this is interesting, recently, the previous work construct snarks for this logical proof of non-membership by either using I/O or learning with error assumption. And our work improved the assumption of I/O or learning with error to sub-exponential DDH. As an example of this class of language, so we show the DDH language, which consists of all the DDH tuples, has this TC0 logical proof of non-membership. So our result implies snarks for DDH language from sub-exponential DDH assumption, where the proof size of the snark doesn't grow with the size of the DDH group. As another application, we show how to build a special form of snarks, which is called monotone policy batch argument. So this is a notion where the prover is given a batch of instances from X1 to Xk, and their NP witnesses from W1 to Wk. And the goal is to convince the verifier that the subset of the instance that is in the language forms some, satisfies some monotone circuit F. Now the succinctness requires that the proof size to be much smaller than the total length of the NP witnesses. And previously, the work by Braksky et al. Constructed this monotone policy bugs from learning with error assumption. And also concurrently, by the work of NASA, Waters, and Wu, they construct these monotone policy bugs from sub-exponential DDH assumption, using a very different approach with ours. Their work also achieves the construction from polynomial hardness of standard assumptions in pairing groups. So as another application of this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption, we also show how to build snarks for these monotone policy bugs from sub-exponential DDH assumption. And there are more results in our paper, such as the construction of predicate extractable hash from sub-exponential DDH, and also the correlation extractable hash from sub-exponential DDH assumption. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to show you the formal definition of this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption. And next, I'm going to show you at a very high-level idea of how to construct this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption for TC0. So next, I'm going to define this notion of sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption step by step. So I'm going to show you some attempt to define this notion, and I'm going to show you what's the issue in the definition and how do we modify the definition to fix them. So firstly, in the keygen algorithm of this homomorphic encryption, we additionally put some predicate, and this predicate is some only privately computable predicate. It is used to decide whether ciphertext can be decrypted correctly. So given any ciphertext X, you can homomorphically evaluate on it to get some ciphertext. And if the ciphertext satisfies this predicate, then the decryption must be correct. So this is the requirement we have on this predicate. So next, we need to lower bound the probability that given any ciphertext, the probability that this ciphertext satisfies this predicate. So we define this sometimes decryptable property as follows. Note that we need to define this notion even for maliciously generated ciphertext, since in our applications of snarks, the prover need to evaluate these. The prover need to generate those homomorphically evaluated ciphertext. So we need the malicious notion. So we define it as follows. We require for any polynomial time adversary, if the adversary sees the public key, it can choose some maliciously generated ciphertext. And finally, we require that the probability this ciphertext satisfies this predicate must be lower bound by some small, but not too small probability, such as 2 to the minus lambda to the c. The issue with this construction, the issue with this definition is that the probability cannot compose. For example, consider an adversary which can maybe evaluate 2 ciphertext, CT1 and CT2. Then from this sometimes decryptable property we just defined, we can only argue that for each ciphertext, they satisfy this predicate with some probability, mu. But we cannot argue any probability that the both ciphertexts are satisfied by this predicate simultaneously, because we are considering a computational bounded adversary. So so what we do is we just avoid such a scenario in the applications of this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption. So the idea is whenever in the application you want to evaluate 2 functions, 2 single-bit output functions f and g, we just avoid such a scenario by combining the input ciphertext into a giant ciphertext that contains the input x and y simultaneously. And we evaluate this function f and g in one shot on this giant ciphertext to get the evaluated ciphertext fx and gy. So this solves the decryption correctness issue for multi-bit output for multiple functions. However, so now the definition of homomorphic evaluation is inherently one-shot. So we cannot talk about, so in this definition, we cannot talk about the intermediate ciphertext for each gate in the circuit f and g. But recall that in the definition of in the construction of FHE from lattice, you can, when you evaluate a function over some FHE ciphertext, you can talk about what is the intermediate ciphertext for each gate in the evaluated circuit. But now, since the evaluation is one shot, so we don't have this structure. But this structure is crucial for the snark application, so we need to have this gate-by-gate structure. So what we do is that we given any ciphertext, and when we evaluate on this ciphertext, we ask the, when we evaluate on this ciphertext, we ask the homomorphic evaluation algorithm to also output the intermediate ciphertext for each gate in the circuit. So we just ask this one-shot evaluation to provide us this intermediate ciphertext for each gate. And we further require the following header and the payload structure for each intermediate ciphertext, which says that the headers of all of the intermediate ciphertext must be the same for all of the intermediate gates. And also, this is a property that is already achieved by FHE-based, by lattice-based FHE construction. Now we modified our definition of the predicate to only require that the predicate only takes the header as the input, and it can decide whether the decryption is correct or not. So this will solve the composition of different output bit issue. The issue, but this also introduces a new issue, which is how can we certify the correctness of those intermediate ciphertext. Also recall that in the lattice-based FHE, for each intermediate gate in the FHE evaluation, the homomorphic evaluation is deterministic. So we can recompute the homomorphic evaluation for the intermediate gates to certify the correctness of them. So we need a similar property in our construction. So in our definition of this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption, we also introduce snarks for local correctness. So our homomorphic evaluation is not gate by gate, but we also provide a snark proof to certify the correctness for each intermediate ciphertext. So finally, this is a summary of our definition for sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption. So in the keychain algorithm, we additionally add some predicate, and the homomorphic evaluation will also generate of the intermediate ciphertext for each gate in the circuit. And we require this header and payload structure. The predicate will only take the header as input, and it will decide whether the decryption is correct. And the decryption correctness is lower bounded by some negligible but not too small function, even for maliciously generated header. Okay. So finally, let me show you a high-level idea of how to construct this sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption. So our starting point of the construction is a homomorphic encryption for linear functions. And this starting point of construction is just a variant of EL gamma encryption. So the keychain algorithm will output a public key which contains some group element G, and it will sample some vector S and write this vector S on the exponent of G. And this consists of the public key. So the secret key is just this vector S, where the length of this S will be the length of the output for these linear functions that you want to evaluate later. So given any message M to encrypt this message, given any message M as a vector to encrypt this message, we re-randomize the public key by this column vector R. So essentially, we multiply this column vector R on the left-hand side of these two components, and we add the message to the second component of this ciphertext. So now to evaluate multi-bit output linear function f, we first represent this f as a bunch of vectors from a bunch of column vectors from f1 to fl. So each vector corresponds to 1 bit in the output of this function f. Then we just homomorphically multiply this vector f on the left of this ciphertext. Then we get the homomorphically evaluated ciphertext. So we just multiply this f on the left, then we get this element. And if you multiply f on the left of this, then you get this the second component. So to decrypt this ciphertext, recall that this is our evaluated ciphertext. To decrypt it, we first denote the first component as the header, and the second component we defined as the payload. To decrypt it, we just compute the header to this secret key S. Then you will get this part. And then we divide the payload part we divide it in the payload part, then we get the rest of the payload, which is the homomorphically evaluated ciphertext, which is the homomorphically evaluated value. So now, so next I'm going to show you how to achieve this local correctness property. And the high-level idea is to rearrange this evaluated ciphertext by viewing this vector f as some addition of this two vector. And then we manipulate the evaluated ciphertext as this form. And then we assume that the second, then we observe that some part of the ciphertext will vanish because it evaluated to 0. And then we apply, we observe that the first part of the ciphertext is indeed a linear relation. So we can use a snark for linear relation in the previous work to construct a snark for it. And for the second part of the ciphertext, we observe that the verifier can compute it by itself. So this is a high-level idea of how we achieve local correctness. And finally, so this is just a starting point to compute the linear functions. So finally, we apply the BGI share conversion to the payload, then we obtain some binary payload. Then we achieve some additive decryption property. So we leverage this property to bootstrap it to build sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption for TC0 by using the previous work by Jian and Jing. So finally, this is a summary of our result. We construct sometimes decryptable homomorphic encryption for TC0 from sub-exponential DDH. And as applications, we show snarks from sub-exponential DDH for languages that has a polynomized TC0 frag proof of non-membership. And we also show how to build snarks for monotone policy bugs. So the key takeaway of this work is that we can use this framework to replace FHE in the proof system applications, such as NISIX and snarks, to achieve constructions from sub-exponential DDH in the pairing-free groups. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one quick question. Who wants to come up to the stage?
Thank you for this talk. So my question is, so in this formulation, the key idea is a header payload structure, right? So the header is in the ciphertext, so it should be a public information. And since we can obtain an honest ciphertext, so we have honest headers that can be decrypted. Then is there a possibility that the malicious party can manipulate the ciphertext so that its malicious ciphertext has the same header as those honest header?
Right, good question. So, right, so when we defined the decryption property, we said if the as long as the header satisfies the predicate, then it should be decrypted correctly. Yeah. So the malicious adversary can choose this header.
So it is not a security issue. It will not cause security issue, right?
Yeah, it won't cause security issue.
Yeah.
Flight and things on again. All right, so our next talk in this session will be on anamorphic resistant encryption, or why the encryption debate is still alive, by Yevgeny Dodis and Eli Golden, and Eli will be giving a talk.
Okay, sorry, second. So yeah, I'm Eli. Today I'm talking about anamorphic resistant encryption. And this is joint work with my advisor, Yevgeny. So I'm going to start by talking about something called the encryption debate. So privacy advocates and all of us in this room generally like encryption and security. We think that security is good, things should be encrypted, people should not be able to read each other's texts. The government agrees most of the time. They like encryption, but they also want to read everybody's texts. And so sometimes they will come and ask privacy advocates, hey, is there any way that you could add a backdoor to the encryption so I can read everybody's text, but still have everything be totally secure and good? And privacy advocates know that this is a bad idea for many, many reasons. I'm not going to get into all the reasons now. I'm going to talk about one of them. And kind of unfortunately, just due to the way the math worked out, I'm actually going to poke some holes into the privacy advocates argument. So in this talk, we're going to be on the side of the government trying to add backdoors to encryption. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about something called steganography. So in this steganographic setting, two parties, pink and gray, are going to be communicating over some channel. They're going to be sending somewhat random messages. So for example, like think photos. And the idea is that pink wants to send gray a secret message that is invisible to any government listening in. And so one way they can do this is to kind of bias the randomness of their channel. So for example, it might be the case that if the sun has like 10 spokes coming out from it, this means that you should overthrow the government at midnight. But if it was really 11 spokes, then it should mean overthrow the government at noon. And the idea is that only gray, who has some shared secret with pink, should be able to read the message, and anybody listening in should not be able to tell that a message has even been sent in the first place. They should think that this is just honest communication. There's no secret messages here. And it turns out that this is actually something that is always possible in any setting where you are sending messages that have sufficient randomness in them. And there's actually one setting that this is always going to be the case, that messages are going to be sufficiently random. And that setting is when you're sending ciphertexts. So encryption must always be random, otherwise it is insecure. And so when you're sending ciphertext, there's always going to be some subliminal channel baked in. And so this leads to the following argument that, hey, there's no point actually backdooring encryption, because people will just use this subliminal steganographic channel inside the ciphertext. And so this was formalized in a work by Persiano, Fan, and Yum as something called anamorphic encryption. And so what anamorphic encryption is, so given any encryption scheme, so gen, enc, dec, an anamorphic instantiation of that scheme is 3 protocols, anamorphic gen, anamorphic enc, and anamorphic dec, which kind of formalize this steganographic chain. So in particular, anamorphic gen will act just like a normal gen will produce a public key and a secret key that look honest. But at the same time, it will also produce a private doubling key, which will be used to instantiate the channel. Anamorphic encryption will then take in 2 messages, so the message M and the anamorphic message AM. And it will produce an anamorphic ciphertext that is going to be an encryption of M, and it should look like an encryption of M, but it will contain a second secret plaintext AM, the anamorphic message. And then finally, the third protocol will be anamorphic decryption, which will take in the doubling key and an anamorphic ciphertext and retrieve out the second secret plaintext AM. And so note that anamorphic encryption is always going to be defined relative to some existing public key encryption scheme, gen, enc, dec. So we'll call it an anamorphic instantiation of that encryption scheme. So what is the intuition behind security? The intuition behind security is that the dictator who's listening in on messages being sent from pink to gray, on anamorphic messages being sent, shouldn't even be able to notice that anamorphic messages were sent at all. It should look to him like that these are all just honest ciphertexts. And this should hold true even if the dictator listening in has access to the secret key and can actually decrypt all of these ciphertexts, as long as the dictator does not have access to the doubling key, the anamorphic green key. So formally, this is going to be modeled by the following security game. So the dictator will ask pink, hey, can you just encrypt the message M and also hide the anamorphic message AM inside of it? And he'll do this over and over again. And the idea is that a dictator who does not have access to the doubling key shouldn't be able to tell whether or not he is getting back ciphertext that contain anamorphic messages or just honest encryptions of M. It should look indistinguishable to him. And I want to point out that in the second one of these settings, the anamorphic doubling key will not even have existed. Pink will just be running public key encryption honestly. So in the first, you shouldn't be able to tell whether or not they've even instantiated the anamorphic protocol. Okay, so it turns out that anamorphic encryption is always possible by a rejection sampling based protocol. So in particular, the pink can just sample ciphertexts until they hash under some shared key to the anamorphic message. And this works perfectly fine. But since it's rejection sampling, you can only handle logarithmic length anamorphic messages. And so this scheme has bandwidth O of log lambda for whatever log you want. So for the generic setting, we have a logarithmic bandwidth solution. And for a number of concrete schemes, we have linear bandwidth solutions. There have been a number of works that have defined O of n bandwidth schemes for many different concrete encryption protocols like now or young, or many types of CCA public key encryptions, and on and on and on, and sometimes with some extra properties that I will not talk about now. But since we have so many works for specific schemes, and we have one approach that works generically. We might hope that, hey, actually, there is a generic approach with linear bandwidth. So this is the kind of big hypothesis in anamorphic encryption before this work, is that linear bandwidth anamorphic instantiations should kind of always be possible. At least heuristically, this should always be possible. And kind of the result that we show is that, hey, actually, no, this is not true. They are not always possible. Sometimes log is the best you can do. Okay. So I'm going to talk briefly about philosophy. So main philosophical question I want to talk about before we get into the actual results is who actually picks what public key encryption schemes are legal? And I'm going to define kind of 3 nations that have various different governments, and various different parties will decide what public key encryption schemes are legal, and we'll kind of talk about what types of protocols make sense for each of these worlds. So in the first setting, we can imagine we're living in a dictatorship, dictatoria, run by Mr. Dictator over here. Dictator wants to read all messages, so he wants to insert some universal backdoor into the encryption scheme. But he still wants encryption to be secure against foreign parties, because he doesn't want other countries to read his citizens' encryption. And he also wants to outlaw non-trivial anamorphism, because anamorphism gets around the universal backdoor. Okay, so the dictator wants an anamorphic resistant scheme that is also backdoored, essentially. The second setting that we will consider is warrant land. So in warrant land, the government is a little bit more reasonable, listens somewhat to privacy advocates, but the government still wants to be able to read all messages. They still want to read messages when a judge issues a warrant, which in our setting we'll model as like a judge coming up to the person saying, hey, you have to give up your secret key. Okay. But on the other hand, the government still is somewhat reasonable. They want privacy even against themselves when no warrant is issued. So they do not want it to be possible for them to install a backdoor. But they still want to outlaw non-trivial anamorphism because, again, this gets around warrants. And the final nation we will consider is Privatopia. Privatopia is a country run by cryptographers. And we want to develop cryptographic protocols that will be secure, even if the cryptographers get overthrown and a normal government or a common government takes over. And so we would like to standardize anamorphic encryption. We would want to define an anamorphic encryption protocol, a protocol that allows anamorphic encryption with the strongest possible properties. And so we're going to talk about schemes that exist for all 3 of these worlds. So we developed some Privatopia schemes in the paper. I'm actually not going to talk in detail about them now, but they roughly revolve around unforgeability. But I'm going to talk about schemes that make Dictatoria and Warrant Land both happen. Okay, so what are our concrete results? So the big formal contribution is that we define something called anamorphic resistant encryption. Anamorphic resistant encryption is just going to be a specific public key encryption scheme such that no non-trivial anamorphism exists. Okay, and so in particular, what I mean by this is that rejection sampling should be the best you should do. All other anamorphic instantiations should also have logarithmic bandwidth. And we will call this anamorphic resistant encryption, or ARE. So I'll use ARE sometimes throughout the talk. Okay. And so for Dictatoria, we will construct an anamorphic resistant encryption scheme with a universal backdoor. This will make them maximally happy because they will be able to read all messages and detect anamorphism even without having to break into people's houses and get their secret key. This will be along with our other results in the random oracle model, which is a slight caveat. For warrant land, we will define an anamorphic resistant encryption scheme which needs secret key access. That is, you should not be able to detect anamorphisms without the secret key. And even if the government has some sort of backdoor, encryption should still be secure. So as long as the secret key is hidden, the encryption should be secure, and the government should not even know if anamorphic messages are sent. And again, in the random oracle model. So what is our construction of anamorphic resistant encryption? Our key idea is going to be that hey, the only way to bias outputs of the encryption scheme should be to do rejection sampling. And what is one thing that the only way to bias it you can do is to do rejection sampling? That is a random oracle. So our key idea will be to replace the randomness of encryption with the output of a random oracle on the randomness. Okay. And so the intuition here is the only way to bias the randomness is to do rejection sampling. And so the only way to kind of add a second message into the encryption scheme is to do rejection sampling. And so if you, for example, if you had an anamorphic encryption scheme that happened to output encryptions of this correct format, then it would be the case that the output of the random oracle on whatever biased randomness the anamorphic encryption chose, this can only provide logarithmically many bits of information about the anamorphic message, and so we would be good. And this is great and all, but it's actually not the case that anamorphic encryption necessarily has to output correct-looking ciphertext. They could just replace the random oracle output with the actual anamorphic message, and the dictator would not be able to know. And so the key thing that we need to add in is we need to add some way to force anamorphic parties to actually output encryptions of this correct format. Okay, and how do we do this? And this is where our second key insight comes in. The idea is we will just tell the dictator the randomness. And how do we do this? We can just include inside the ciphertext just a second encryption under the dictator's public key of the randomness itself. So this will not break security because not all parties will be able to get the randomness, but the dictator will be able to get the randomness of the scheme. Okay, and the dictator's public key will just be included in the public parameters of the protocol, and the dictator will be modeled as having some backdoor to the public parameters. Okay, so then we know anamorphic ciphertext have to be of this form, because if they are not, the dictator could just decrypt the second ciphertext and then reconstruct the ciphertext and see that it matches. And so this is great. Now there's no way to include anamorphic, a second message, inside that first ciphertext. But the second ciphertext is still random, so easy attack. The anamorphic party can just include the anamorphic message embedded within the second ciphertext. Okay? And you might hope that you can get around this problem by just repeating this process, but this will just continue ad infinitum. So instead, we make the observation that there's no way for them to include an anamorphic message in the second ciphertext if that ciphertext is not random, if you somehow use deterministic encryption to encrypt this randomness of encryption. Okay, so unfortunately, deterministic encryption is not possible. This is not something that you can do even in the random oracle model. But it is actually possible in some restricted settings, usually when the randomness of encryption, or when the message itself is very random. And it happens to be the case that in our setting, with some work, you can get the properties you would want from deterministic encryption, such that it's usable in our protocol. So the deterministic encryption we will use will just be like encrypt with hash, for those who know. Okay, so in the end, our final construction, an encryption of a message M will be an encryption of that message M under the output of a random oracle, followed by a deterministic encryption of the input to the random oracle. And now anamorphic ciphertexts must be of this form because it can be checked. And also the only information revealed to the anamorphic receiver about the anamorphic message will be the output of this random oracle, which again can only contain logarithmically many bits of information about the anamorphic message. Okay. So as I said, as I promised in Dictatoria, we would give a scheme that is anamorphic resistant and has a universal backdoor. We can add a universal backdoor very easily to our protocol by just including the message inside the second ciphertext. And now a dictator can read all messages and detect covert messages just by decrypting the second ciphertext and reading M and then checking whether the ciphertext was constructed honestly. For Warrantland, I promised a scheme that cannot be backdoored or that does not have a backdoor. This is not going to be the case of this scheme since the government can just read the randomness and thus break encryption. But we can solve this issue by just including this deterministic ciphertext inside of the first ciphertext instead of the honest one. And now the government really needs the secret key in order to either detect anamorphism or to break the public key encryption. So this backdoor doesn't actually help them for security reasons. And so those are our results. I'm going to conclude on some open questions. So the first open question is whether it is possible to get anamorphic resistant encryption in the standard model. There is a later work which does actually do this from exponential DDH. That's a very, very strong assumption. So we would like something more reasonable or more realizable. The second question is whether you can get rid of the public parameters. I think the next talk actually will talk about a protocol that does not have public parameters, but for a slightly weaker notion of anamorphic resistant encryption. And finally, the most important question is, can we bypass this impossibility? It would be really nice if like some weaker notion of anamorphic encryption would be possible always. I'm not sure exactly how to define it, but this is, I guess, up to you all. And thank you all for listening.
Great. So we have one time for questions, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm very new to this topic, so maybe a naive question, but do you think it would be possible to design an anamorphic encryption scheme that would like make, for example, dictatorial universally unhappy and be efficient?
Wait, I'm sorry. You're saying a scheme that would make the dictator happy and also be efficient?
The precisely like something that would make dictatorial unhappy and be efficient and stuff like that.
I mean, there are plenty of anamorphic instantiations of like existing public key encryption schemes that I guess would make the dictator unhappy. But I guess the worry is that the dictator could always just force you to use this one, in which case there's nothing you can do. But maybe weakening the definition could help or something like this. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. So let's take further questions offline. And thank you, Eli, again. All right, so continuing the theme of anamorphic encryption, our next talk will be on anamorphic resistant encryption, the good, the bad, and the ugly by David Caramella, Dario Catalano, Emmanuel Junta, and Francisco Migliaro, and David will be giving a talk.
Okay, so hi, thank you for the introduction. This is a joint work with Dario Catalano, Emanuele Giunta, and Francesco Migliaro. So let's recall again how anamorphic encryption, what is anamorphic encryption? So we know that in a standard public key encryption scenario, we have a sender and a receiver. Then the receiver generates a public key and a secret key. And after that, the sender will be able to encrypt a message using the public key of the receiver. And usually, the security requirement that we ask is that the encryption of a message M0 looks like the encryption of a message M1 from an adversary point of view. But what happens if we consider a stronger adversary that we call regulator that is able to force the receiver to give him the secret key? In this case, the security requirement does not hold, and so the privacy of the communication is lost. And so this happens because when we model the security of an encryption scheme, we rely on an implicit assumption that is called receiver privacy assumption that guarantees that the secret key cannot be compromised. So this is the reason why anamorphic encryption was introduced. And in particular, we can define anamorphic encryption as a triplet of algorithms. So again, we have a sender, a receiver, and a regulator. But now, when the receiver calls the generation algorithm, she generates a public key and a secret key, but also an additional key that we call double key that is shared with the sender. And then, when the sender calls the encryption algorithm, it will be able to encrypt two different messages using only one ciphertext. And in particular, the first one will be an innocent-looking message, while the second one, a TEM, will be a covert message. And then the receiver will be able to decrypt the covert message using the double key, while if the regulator asks for the secret key, he will be able to decrypt the innocent-looking message. And also, we require that the ciphertext must be a regular-looking encryption of the message arm. And we define the security of an anamorphic triplet with respect to a PKE as follows. So we have two different games, and in both of them, the adversary receives a public key and a secret key, and after that, he can ask for the encryption of a message M and a covert message at M several times. And at the end, he has to say if we are in the real game or in the anamorphic game. And so we can say that an anamorphic triplet is secure with respect to a PKE if the real game is computationally indistinguishable from the anamorphic game. So we know several constructions of anamorphic encryption, and some of them are for specific encryption scheme, but also we have a generic construction that makes use of rejection sampling, but that is not so generic as expected. So we can talk about some limits about anamorphic encryption. And so this is the set of all public key encryption schemes. And then we have a subset of public key encryption schemes that has Eigenmean entropy ciphertext. And so we already know that black box constructions of anamorphic encryption allow to transmit at most log lambda bits. And this is a tight result. And so this is catched by the rejection sampling construction. Also, we know that powerful tool like verifiable virtual black box obfuscation does not help to bypass this limit. Then we know that stateless anamorphic encryption is impossible in a black box way. And also, again, that verifiable virtual black box obfuscation does not help to bypass this limit. Then we know that asymmetric anamorphic encryption is impossible in a black box way, but also we know a concrete construction from indistinguishability obfuscation. So the above results apply only to black box construction. And so our work comes from a question, and the question is if there exists a concrete PKE such that there is no stateless anamorphic triplet that is secure. And in particular, we use the name anamorphic resistant encryption from the paper of Dodis and Goldin presented before. But in their case, they defined an anamorphic resistant encryption scheme as a secure PKE such that for any anamorphic encryption scheme, the size of the covert message must be at most log lambda bits. While in our case, we defined an anamorphic resistant encryption scheme as a secure PKE such that the sender is not able to encrypt any covert message, even if it's only a bit of information. So in our case, the size of the covert message must be equal to 0. OK, so let's talk about the bad and the ugly of our paper. And the bad news is that such schemes exist. And to show that, we proposed two different compilers that allows us to make any public key encryption scheme with large message space anamorphic resistant. And in particular, the first construction is in the public parameters model and makes use of injective one-way function, indistinguishability obfuscation, and extremely lossy function. While the second one does not need public parameters nor I/O, but it is in the random oracle model. So for time reasons, I will talk you only about the first construction. And as I said before, the first construction is in the public parameters model. So we have, again, a sender, a receiver, and a regulator. And now the regulator generates some public parameters and a trapdoor TD. Then the receiver generates a public key, a secret key, and then the sender will be able to encrypt a message as before. OK, so our starting point to construct an anamorphic resistant encryption scheme is the concept of weak messages introduced by Catalano et al. This year. And we say that a message is weak if it has only polynomially many-valued ciphertext, if this message is indistinguishable from any other random message, and also if it's hard to find this message given only the public key. OK, so we can see a sketch of our construction, just to give you an idea of how our construction works. So we can start with the init algorithm. So this is the algorithm that will be used by the regulator to generate the public parameters and the trapdoor. And so it works as follows. So it samples some messages M1 star and lambda star, and these will be the weak messages. And then it computes the injective one-way function in all of these points. And after that, it generates a function f for each of these messages. And this function will be generated using the extremely lossy function. And this primitive allows us to generate a function in two different modes. The first one will be an injective mode, so we will obtain an injective function. And the second one will be a lossy mode, so we will obtain a function that has a small image size. And these two modes are indistinguishable. And in this case, we will generate a function f in lossy mode. So we will have a function with small image size. Then it constructs a circuit C that on input a message M, first of all, checks if this message is weak. And this check will be done using the outputs of the injective one-way function. And then if the message is weak, it outputs the function generated before. While in other case, it will generate a new function, but in injective mode. And then the public parameters will be composed by the circuit C obfuscated using I/O, while the trapdoor will be composed by the set of all weak messages. Okay, so the encryption algorithm works as follows. So it calls the obfuscated circuit C on input the message M. And so we will obtain a function f that could be injective or lossy. And then we will use this function to bias the random coin of the underlying encryption algorithm. Okay, so we have to prove that our construction is in CPA, and this is an idea. So to prove that, we can say that the injective one-way function protects the weak messages in the CPA game, while the indistinguishability obfuscation and ELF masks the different behavior between the encryption of weak messages and the encryption of standard messages. And at the end, we rely on the NCPA security of the underlying PK. Also, we are able to achieve in CCA security if the underlying PK satisfies this property. Okay, now we can prove that our construction is anamorphic resistant. And to do that, we show the existence of a regulator that is able to distinguish between the real game and the anamorphic game. And in particular, the regulator samples a weak message M star from the trapdoor, and then it will be able to compute the function f associated to this message. And also, it will be able to find the size of the image of this function. And then he asked to the challenger for the encryption of the message M star and the covert message 0 several times. And then he stores this ciphertext in a set as 0. And then he will do the same for the covert message 1, but now he stores this ciphertext in a set as 1. And then he says that we are in the real game if the size of the set as 0 and the set as 1 is equals to the size of the image of the function f. And this will happen with a high probability when we are in the real game, because we are using the encryption algorithm that we have seen before, while due to the correctness of the encryption, the anamorphic encryption triplet, this cannot be possible. So we are able to, the regulator will be able to distinguish between the real game and the anamorphic game. Okay, so now we can talk about the good of our paper. And the good news is that we found a strong connection between anamorphic encryption and algorithm substitution attacks. So let's recall what algorithm substitution attacks are. So again, we have a sender and a receiver. But now we have an additional party that is called Big Brother. And this party can be seen as a provider of the implementation of the encryption scheme that will be used by the sender and the receiver to communicate in privacy. And this Big Brother can be seen as a messaging application provider or a library provider. And the goal of the big brother is to steal information about the communication, but without being detected. So it is a three-bit algorithm. So the receiver generates a public key and a secret key. And also we have an additional key that is known by the big brother that we call its key. And then when the sender calls the encryption algorithm, he will encrypt two different messages using only one ciphertext. And the first one will be the real message that he wants to send, while the second one will be a covert message used by the big brother to steal information about the communication. And then we require that when the receiver calls the decryption algorithm of the underlying of the standard PKE, then she will be able to decrypt the message M, while the big brother must be able to extract the covert message using an extraction algorithm. And also, we require that the ciphertext must be a regular-looking encryption of the message M. And so, as I said before, we found a strong connection between algorithm substitution attacks and anamorphic encryption. So we found that algorithm substitution attacks implies anamorphic encryption, but also that anamorphic encryption implies algorithm substitution attacks. And so, from these results, we are able to reinterpret our compilers as tools to do good stuff. In fact, until now, we know that encryption schemes that are resistant against algorithm substitution attacks are deterministic schemes, or if we want to achieve in CPA security, we need to rely on non-black box techniques or trust assumption. While using our compilers, we are able to achieve in CCA security if their underlying PKE satisfies this property, or to preserve the homomorphic properties of the underlying PKE. And also, since our compilers are black box, we can use our favorite public encryption scheme. So that's all, and thank you for the attention.
Great. We have time for questions. If you have one, please come up. So I have one question I can ask. So for your main construction, you mentioned this construction based on obfuscation.
Sorry?
So your first construction relies on obfuscation plus injective one-way functions plus extremely lossy functions, right? And that construction needed a structured reference string in a public parameter model. So that construction requires a structured reference string in a public parameter model, right?
Yeah.
So do you think there's any hope of getting something using a common random string?
Sorry?
Do you think there's any hope of getting a scheme where the public parameters is a uniform random string? Or is structured strings inherent here?
Oh, I don't know. Okay, I have to think about that. Okay, sorry.
Okay, sounds good. All right, any other questions? All right, if not, let's thank David again. All right, so our final talk of this session will be on a framework for witness encryption from linearly verifiable snarks and applications by Sanjam Garg, Mohammed Hajabadi, Dimitris Kololinos, Abhiram Kosapati, and Guru Vamsi Policharla. And Guru will be giving a talk.
Thanks. All right, so let's dive in. What is witness encryption? Think of your favorite NP relation R, and witness encryption essentially allows you to encrypt to a statement X, such that you can decrypt the ciphertext if and only if you know a valid witness W, such that X comma W is in the relation R. Okay, so witness encryption for all of NP is really great, and I would love to have it, but unfortunately, we don't have any concretely efficient construction so far. And there's been some recent progress, but it seems like we're still kind of far away from being able to implement these schemes. And today, what I'm going to focus on is building actually concretely efficient witness encryption schemes, but for special relations and some applications that are going to come out of there, okay? And if you kind of go and look in the literature, right, there's actually a lot of examples of special purpose witness encryption schemes. So starting with like IBE and hash proof systems back in the 2000s, there's been like a lot of works that come out since then, and they all either explicitly or sometimes implicitly use special purpose witness encryption schemes. So if you kind of go and look at these papers, right, they kind of look somewhat arbitrary and unrelated. And in this work, we asked the following question, which is, can we actually systematically study special purpose witness encryption schemes and design a framework that allows us to not only recover previously known results, but also come up with new feasibility results. So to do this, we sort of began by developing an informal taxonomy of witness encryption, essentially just categorizing everything that exists. And let's go through it, right? So there's this first generation of witness encryption schemes, which is kind of the vanilla version that we know and love. You just encrypt to a statement X, and to decrypt, you need the witness W. So here, the encryption, decryption, and ciphertext size sort of grows with the size of the relation you're trying to encrypt to. And by size of the relation, think of it as the size of the verification circuit. So in the second generation of witness encryption schemes, something interesting starts to happen, which is rather than encrypting to the statement, you're actually going to encrypt to a hash of the statement, which is like, think of it as a short digest. And the nice part is that now the encryption algorithm doesn't need to know this entire statement. It only needs to know this little digest H. And OK, let's say to decrypt, you still need this entire witness. But the nice part here is that because the encryption algorithm only needs the short version of the statement, it's kicked off this entire line of work on laconic cryptography. So if you think about laconic OT, this hash would essentially be hashing the receiver's choice bits. And if you think about laconic PSI, this hash would be like hashing the receiver's database. And the sender would only need the succinct digest. So in the third generation, something even more interesting starts to happen, which is rather than encrypting to the relation R, what we're going to do is encrypt to a completely different relation R prime, OK? And this relation R prime is much smaller than R. And what you're going to do is show that there actually exists a computational reduction from R prime to R. And the way to interpret this is think of applying a snark to the relation R. This is going to give you some sort of snark verifier. And doing the verification of the snark is going to be much more efficient than checking that the relation is satisfied. And then what you do is actually build a witness encryption for the snark's verifier. So this R prime you should think of as the snark verifier relation, and R is the original relation. So what this allows us to do now is build a witness encryption scheme, which kind of still targets the original relation R, but has encryption time, decryption time, and ciphertext size, which is much, much smaller. So if I had to kind of classify the schemes that we had on the earlier slide, this is sort of how I would put them. And today, what we're going to do is focus on building a framework that allows us to construct third generation witness encryption schemes, which is this third column over here. OK, so what are our results? So we have a gadget-based framework to build witness encryption. So this actually makes it really easy to use. So and as we go along the talk, we'll see more details. But think of the analog of ZK libraries, where you have like implementations of commonly used primitives, and you can kind of go and stitch them together as and when you need to build your application. To use this framework, you don't need any prior knowledge of Snark. It's going to be very simple to use. And we prove security in the GGM. Now, why do we pick the GGM? It's sort of the strongest assumption that you could make, which in turn allows a framework to capture the widest class of relations that you could build witness encryption for. OK? We also show that our framework recovers essentially all known third generation witness encryption schemes. So it's not going to be the exact scheme, but you'll get similar asymptotics. We also improve the best known result for registered AB. So in particular, we get registered AB with a linear sized CRS. And we also established new feasibility results. So we have a new primitive that we call registered threshold encryption. We define it and also show how to instantiate it using our framework. OK, so before we dive into all of this, let's try to understand the landscape here, right? Like, what class of relations can you actually build efficient witness encryption schemes for? And people have asked this questions before. And the short answer is relations with a linear verifier. So what do I mean by linear? Take your relation and express it as a set of pairing product equations, where you're going to have 4 types of terms. So statement variables getting paired with statement variables, statement variables getting paired with witness variables, and witness variables getting paired with witness variables. I'm going to say that this pairing product equation has linear verification if this 4th type of term never occurs. And they're essentially compilers that allow you to go from this pairing product equation version to the corresponding witness encryption, okay? And this is great, right? So all you need to do is somehow magically arrive at this linear relation. But when you start trying to build your application, this is not typically how you would think, right? You would kind of define some sort of natural relation, which is maybe like a function or a circuit, and then you kind of need to figure out how to make it linear. But at least a priori, it's not at all clear how you automatically do this, right? And also, unless you're kind of familiar with like how to get succinctness and so on by using the snark machinery, it's kind of hard to really leverage these linear relations. So our framework essentially tries to close this gap, okay? And the main goal is to simplify the process of translating natural relations to linear relations, okay? So what we do is we provide gadgets that are witness encryption schemes for small but useful relations. So think of them as signatures, PRFs, inner products, zero check, and so on. And gadgets can actually be composed with each other to build witness encryption schemes for larger relations. They also fully capture the succinctness, so you don't have to worry about the snark machinery going on. And they're also very easy to use, and you can extend them with new gadgets as and when you need. So what we do is, if you want to use our framework, you come up with this natural relation. You kind of express it as, a product of our gadgets. And then our compiler is going to take over, translate it to the linear relation, and actually give you the witness encryption. Okay? So I've told you about the framework. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to show you how to use our framework to build distributed broadcast encryption. And I'll show you our construction for registered ABE with the linear size CRS. Okay. So what is distributed broadcast encryption? The goal is very simple. You have n parties, and I want to encrypt a message to them with a constant size ciphertext. And I don't want any interaction during the setup except for a PKI. And note that if I gave you public key encryption, you could do this using an O of n size ciphertext. So with some more pictures, let's say there's capital N users in the system. You pick some arbitrary subset, and I want you to be able to encrypt to them with a constant sized ciphertext. And you just want semantic security against everybody that's not in this set. Okay? So good. So let's try to identify a natural relation which would be sufficient for us to build this application. And okay, let's say everybody has a public key pair, which is just like an El-Gamal key pair. And suppose we had a succinct witness encryption for the following relation, okay? Which is you can decrypt my ciphertext if you know a secret key which corresponds to a public key, and this public key is in this list of vectors that I specify, okay? So I've hopefully convinced you that this is sufficient to get the application. Now, how do we actually build this? Now comes our first gadget, which is the inner product gadget. And it's very simple. The statement is n group elements, and there's another group element, v. The witness is n field elements, such that the linear combination of u1 to un is going to be equal to v. Okay? So if you find such a linear combination, and I encrypt it to u1 to un comma v, you can essentially decrypt my ciphertext. Okay? And just trust me for now that the ciphertext actually has constant size. And the encryption algorithm can actually take a succinct commitment to ubar, so it can run in constant time once you create this succinct commitment. Good. So now how do we do the second step, right? Which is translating our natural relation and expressing it in terms of the gadgets. So I'm going to reduce the DBE to just using the inner product gadget. Okay? So every user has a public key pair. And all you need to do is set this ubar to be this vector of public keys. And this element v to be the generator of the group, just g to the 1, right? So effectively, what we've achieved is we've said, OK, you can decrypt my ciphertext if you can find a linear combination of public keys such that it's equal to g, right? And I claim that this actually realizes the witness encryption that we need. Why is that? So for correctness, you can observe that honest users will just decrypt using the all 0 string, except at the ith position where they put the inverse of their secret key. So this will be correct. And turns out, if an adversary can produce such a linear combination to do this, then you can actually just embed a discrete log challenge and solve dlog. So okay, now that's it. That's the whole scheme. And okay, you get security in the GGM, and you've essentially built DBE now. Very simple. So let's go to the next construction, which is registered ABE. So the goal of registered ABE is to just do attribute-based encryption without a trusted party, okay? I don't want any interaction during the setup except for a PKI, and I'm going to impose some notions of efficiency. So let's say there's m users, And what they're going to do is kind of go on a bulletin board and post their public key along with their attributes, right? And let's say I want to encrypt a message to all cryptographers that are in the EU region, okay? But the thing that I don't want to do is have to read the entire bulletin board because it's going to be very big. And I also want my encryption, decryption, and ciphertext size to be succinct. So let's say polylog in the number of users. So the way I'm going to fix issue number 1 is by having a helper party who's only trusted for integrity. They don't have any secrets. And what they're going to do is help me compress the bulletin board down to a succinct key. And for the second issue, I'm just going to use a 3rd generation witness encryption scheme that I'll tell you. Okay. So in a bit more detail, how this primitive would work is there's a key curator, and they're going to essentially produce, so they're going to produce a short aggregated public key of the bulletin board. And to encrypt, you just need that APK, and then you specify your predicate. So the key curator is also going to produce helper keys, which are user-specific material. It's going to be succinct in the number of users and so on. And using this helper key, you're going to be able to decrypt the message along with your secret key. Okay. Good. So let's build this application, right? So the first step is to identify this natural relation. And the natural relation looks something like this, right? You can decrypt my ciphertext if you know a secret key such that the corresponding public key is in both the crypto and the EU sets. Okay, so how do we build it? I've essentially rewritten the table where I've put zeros wherever a public key didn't occur. So now, okay, we wanted to achieve this relation, and then we've seen this membership kind of thing appear in the DB. So let's try to use the inner product gadget again. So let's say I do something like this, right? Which is I demand that you know a vector W such that your public key is a linear combination of the crypto set of public keys, and also the same linear combination applied to the European Union set of public keys gives you the same public key, okay? And the thing is, this construction almost works, except the adversary can use the empty slots, which are these zeros, to cheat, and essentially, because everybody knows the secret key of 0, which is basically 0. And what we need to do is prevent the adversary from cheating in this manner. And to do that, I'm going to introduce the zero check gadget, which is essentially very simple. So the statement is just a subset of n indices. And the witness is a vector of n field elements such that the ith positions whenever, for all I and s, wi is 0. And okay, you can decrypt my ciphertext if you can produce such a witness. And by itself, this gadget is not very interesting. You can always produce such a vector. But combined with the inner product gadget, we'll see why it becomes interesting. And this witness encryption also has a constant size ciphertext and just takes as input a commitment to the set S. Okay, good. So if you had the zero check gadget and the inner product gadget, how would you build registered ABE? The way to do it is essentially to enforce that the witness vector W is 0 at all positions where you have empty slots. And additionally, you're going to use another gadget to say that the W is non-zero, okay? And I claim that this is sufficient to realize registered ABE. Okay, so I don't have time to go into the proof, but let's quickly analyze why this at least achieves the efficiency goals that we want. So what the key curator is going to do is help us produce a witness for this relation. So they're going to create succinct commitments to the crypto vector, the EU vector, and all the 0 positions. And what this allows us to do is produce a witness sort of for free, using the helper key, which is going to be the witness for these things that I've highlighted. And to kind of finish the decryption, you're just going to use your secret key. Okay? And effectively, what we've done is we've avoided reading the entire bulletin board, and all of our algorithms are going to be succinct in the number of users. Okay? And if you kind of stare at it, right, what is this relation really doing? It's saying, okay, take your crypto public keys, find sort of a non-trivial linear combination to result in a public key, and just prove to me that you know the secret key of that particular group element. And then, by imposing the right constraints, we've essentially forced the adversary to use like a public key that actually exists in these two sets. So before I conclude, I want to mention this nice line of work that's to try to improve the CRS size. So the first work, which was HLWW23, started off with a quadratic size CRS. And it was improved to m to the 1 plus little o of 1, where m is the number of users. And essentially, all works could do NC1 policies. So our scheme has a truly linear CRS size, but we have a smaller policy, which is just DNFs. And we get security in the GGM, whereas prior work gets security in essentially from falsifiable assumptions. And the way to interpret this result is not that, okay, this is sort of the end goal, but I would say this kind of shows that you can actually achieve linear-sized CRS in registered AB. And now you can kind of take the insights from our framework to kind of say, okay, how do I take these ideas and actually build a registered AB with a truly linear-sized CRS? Okay, thank you for listening.
We have time for one or two quick questions. Let me start. So in your registered ABE construction, it only supports conjunctions or DNFs by concatenation, I assume. Do you see any difficulties or challenges in extending beyond
Really, I think
conjunctions?
we didn't spend enough time on it, but I expect that using techniques from your paper, we should be able to identify a gadget, which then takes us to NC1, I think.
I see. So you
Yeah,
can support
I don't
any linear
suspect there's
ABE?
any.
What about for circuits?
Not sure. I would have to think more about that. Yeah, for NC1, I think you should be able to.
I see.
But yeah.
I see. Okay, great. Thanks.
If you can maybe show us the CRS slide on the previous thing. So the universe, so when you say that things are CRS are proportional to the number of users, are there any issues in matching, if the universe is huge, but the subset of users is like moderate, is there any issues with like matching users to the thing or?
So you assume that users kind of know their position and it's like bounded and like you kind of need to pick a location when you post on the bulletin board?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So there is work I think that also David has been doing, which allows you to kind of do it. Yeah.
You didn't address it. Okay.
You can handle that issue. Yeah.
So let's thank Guru again. Right, and that concludes the session.